So welcome to the last session of our week-long webinar series on Islamic socialism in the Global South. Today we will be focusing on Algeria and Sudan. And it's my great pleasure to introduce our two speakers for tonight. Muriam Haleh Davis is an assistant professor in history at the University of California, Santa Cruz. Her current book project, which studies how understandings of Islam contributed to economic policies in Algeria during the colonial and post-colonial periods, is currently under contract with Duke University Press. And Muriam, her articles have also appeared in the Journal of Contemporary History and European Integration History. Our second speaker is Willow Berridge, who is a specialist in 20th century Sudanese history with a particular interest in political ideology, policing law, and civil protest. And she has published 3 monographs that all touch on the questions of Islam and socialism in the context of Sudan, most notably Hassan al-Turabi, Islamist Politics and Democracy in Sudan, that came out with Cambridge University Press in 2017. Thanks so much for joining us, and we are very much looking forward to the discussion and your presentations. And Muriam is going first, right? Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you to Simon and Layli for organizing this and inviting me to speak. It's really a pleasure to be part of these webinars and to be in conversation with Willow about the Sudan. We were just chatting before we got started about what a tumultuous and exciting year it's been in those countries. So I hope we'll come back to that perhaps in the discussion. I thought I would start on a point that is both historical and theoretical, and hopefully this will get us back to some of the larger questions about rethinking Western Marxism and socialism from the Global South. And I apologize if some of you might know this story already, but Karl Marx actually went to Algeria in the late 1880s as he was seeking to cure a lung ailment. And so he sends a wonderful series of letters to Engels reflecting on his time in North Africa. About the subject. Sorry, there was just a bit of a recording message I just received. And Marx basically concludes as he's visiting a Moorish cafe that while, and these are his terms, the Muslims' hatred of Christianity stemmed from a deep desire for equality, the natives were damned without a true revolutionary movement. And this question of what is a true revolutionary movement, was the War of Independence a true revolution, is something that comes up both in Algerian history and in trying to think about what does it mean to have a socialist tradition and how does it articulate with questions of Islam. In the Algerian case, I think it's particularly interesting because it's undeniable that Algeria is one of the most clear examples of a revolutionary socialist heritage, as well as being a Muslim country. And yet the question of Islamic socialism is one that really ruffles a lot of feathers. If anybody wants an example, I would refer you to my Twitter account, where when I tweeted about this event, I got a couple of Algerians kind of very annoyed that how could you even talk about this? What does this mean? It can never work. I resisted the engagement, but I do think that there's a kind of resistance to even talking about this in these terms. So what do you do with a case study where you have the paradigmatic kind of socialist allegedly revolution and a very clear Islamic identity and a civil war, of course, and yet these two terms are seen as so incompatible. So I hope to come back to some of these questions about rethinking socialism from the Global South. But I'll just notice that Marx offers one example of why the socialist tradition is problematic seen from Algeria. He clearly misunderstands land use patterns, for example. He wants to see it in a kind of Russian model. And his notion of revolution, as I've hinted at, is kind of bracketed by this need for a true secular revolution. So why do we come about this category of Islamic socialism? Why for Ben Bella does he say, you know, it's not Arab socialism, it's not North African, Maghrebi socialism, it's Islamic socialism? And to do some of that work, we have to go back to the strands of Algerian nationalism. This is a very broad sketch. I would hesitate to really invest that these were totally different strands. There were lots of overlaps and conversations. But generally, when you look at the War of Independence, there were three kind of ideological strands that had built into it. The first, and here's where you get really the socialism component of Algerian socialism, comes from Messali Haj. And Messali Haj was one of the first nationalists to actually call for separatism. He was a deeply committed Marxist, and his politicization occurred not in Algeria, but in the factories and communist parties of France. So this is really key to understanding how Algerian nationalism and socialism articulates with European strands and thought. And I think Algeria is perhaps quite specific in how direct that link was. The first expression of Algerian separatism comes from the metropole, right? That's a quite, and in a break with the French Communist Party, who had been wanting to put the global revolution before the anti-colonial struggle. And so this is a point where many Algerians, including Messali Haj himself, come to fall out with organized communism as it exists in the 1940s and 50s. The second would be an assimilationist branch. I don't love that term, but there it is. People like Farhat Abbas, who are the kind of rising Algerian middle class, pharmacists, doctors, lawyers, who speak French and are very committed to the ideals of French republicanism and equality. And for Farhat Abbas, this leads him not only to promote the French language, but also to say famously that he would have been a nationalist if he had found an Algerian nation in the history books. He says, I've looked through the history, I don't see an Algerian nation. And he changes his mind on that later, but the point there being that the Algerian experience with colonization was so thoroughly destructuring that there was nothing clear about what an Algerian nation would look like. You know, the last political memory was, of course, the Ottoman Empire. And so the notion of what is an Algerian nation, what is that identity based in, is not a given, does not have an obvious response. And the response to that comes from the third strand, which comes from the association of the Algerian ulama, which is an interwar project of religious scholars. And famously, Abdelhamid Ben Badis, who says, and again, this is in contrast to that assimilationist school I just mentioned, he says, Islam is our religion, Arabic is our language, and Algeria is our country. And so even though the ulama were not necessarily separatists, they were looking for ways to exist, reforms within the French colonial structure for many years. And this is something I was taking Algerian history classes in Algiers when I was there for my research. And when the professor said this, that Ben Badis was not a separatist, there were students in the room who started to cry. I mean, it's such I say this because the notion that Ben Badis is the first Algerian nationalist is so ingrained among nationalist consciousness that the political program is not always so well known. So that was a interesting, but for me a bit awkward moment of my anthropological life, although I'm a historian. So the question for the FLN, which is of course the nationalist party that wages the war, is what do you do with these three strands of Algerian nationalism? And it's a delicate balance. With the Messaliists, Messali Haj and the more communist supporters, more or less it's a question of either absorbing or liquidating. And there is a kind of civil war that occurs between the FLN and supporters of Messali Haj during the war. And French common opinion, public opinion, is very late to see this. And they actually think that the Messaliists are the one winning the war and waging the war. And I mention this because, again, French opinion is so convinced that revolution will be a communist revolution, and that anything that flirts with Arabo-Islamic themes is necessarily reactionary, it's necessarily feudal. And this, I think, goes a long way to explaining how Islamic socialism becomes articulated in the 1960s. And I'll say, you know, in thinking about Algeria in a broader kind of comparative framework, many French leftists look at Nasser with horror. This kind of, they see a pan-Arab threat that's not revolutionary. And so, you know, as we're thinking about socialism and these categories, I think it's very difficult to disentangle them from the kind of European center of what socialism should look like. And I think that's part of the project that we're all embarked on today. And so as the FLN is waging this war against France from 1954 to 1962, it's really the Algerian ulama who give some ideological substance to the revolution. And something that's been interesting to me as I've been able to look at some of the archives, there's not very many from the Algerian side during the war, but the provisional government of the Algerian Republic has some archives that luckily I was able to be seen. They tend to disappear and then come back again, but I got to see them when they were still in present in some way. And there are debates about what the revolution or the anti-colonial struggle is about. And that is, for us now, we look back at the Algerian Revolution, it's clearly a third worldist, anti-imperial struggle. But the question of, is this a revolution? Or is this an anti-colonial struggle? Is this a form of jihad? These are all ways of seeing the struggle that were co-terminus at the time. That is, the FLN was not able to impose one definition of the struggle. And you get thawra and jihad by different actors with different ideological tendencies. And I would refer everybody to this wonderful article by Fanny Colonna about, can you find a subaltern in Algeria? And her answer is no, that the social and political and economic field and linguistic field is so deeply fragmented that there is no subaltern positionality. And so going forward, as the FLN is trying to overcome these divisions, it has to do a lot of kind of difficult ideological work. And some of that ideological work is, as I hinted at, thinking about this in terms of pan-Arabism, right? That would be the obvious category to think about Islamic socialism with. But that's very problematic seen from Algeria in many ways. First of all, one of the major tensions is between the Berber element, so the original population who are Muslim but not Arab or don't see themselves as Arab, even though that itself is somewhat of a colonial construction I'd be happy to talk about. But to this, you know, the Berber question was very strong, not only in the early 1960s, it continues to be. When you had Amazigh flags at demonstrations for the Hirak recently, the government clamped down on that. And one of the slogans that's been used with certain elements of Berber activists is "Corriger l'histoire, l'Algérie n'est pas arabe." So, you know, go back and fix the history. Algeria is not Arab. And so this question of an Arab socialism is a problem not only for the Berber element, but also linguistically. I mean, this is a country where Ben Bella, when he goes to Egypt, he ends up in tears at one point because he doesn't speak Fusha. I mean, his attempts, you know, to speak quote unquote proper Arabic is something he actually learns later in life. So given the importance of the Arabic language and Arab ethnicity to debates on pan-Arabism, Arab socialism in Algeria is a kind of different articulation. And I'll also say, in part of my work, I look at depictions of Algeria from the Mashriq, from specifically Lebanon. And a lot of the terms that they're using to see Algeria in terms of an Arab watan are not ones that Algerians themselves are using. So there is a kind of gap between Algerian self-understanding and reality and this kind of pan-Arabism, including a kind of uneasy relationship with Nasser. So that's just one footnote. I'll also say that, so while Islam becomes the element that can bring these different groups together, including the Berbers, there had been, of course, indigenous Algerian Jews and they were given French citizenship in 1870. So they're a bit apart, even though, of course, they're part of the framework. They, for the most part, leave for France, interestingly, France and not Israel, in 1962. So this is all to get at why I think Islam and not Arabness becomes the confederating element ideologically. After 1962, and here I'm getting in, I think I still have about 5 minutes, right? I'm trying to keep time, look at notes, and be on Zoom, but just let me know if I'm running over somebody. After 1962, Ben Bella is in this very strange position where Algeria has become the mantle of third worldism. And so people like Michel Raptis, known as Pablo, and other well-known third worldists and Trotskyists come to Algeria, and they're known as the Pieds Rouges, so the red feet, literally, in comparison to the Pieds Noirs, or the settlers who are known as the black feet. And so these elements are both great for Ben Bella. They gave the regime a certain amount of standing internationally, right? To have Pablo come and set up shop. People like Daniel Guérin come. René Dumont visits Algeria multiple times. So it becomes a kind of who's who of third world thinkers, and particularly Trotskyist thinkers. And so he, of course, sees this as a kind of feather in his cap, but at the same time, this is not necessarily what many Algerians signed up for. There's some great tidbits in the archives where these figures are giving talks in public, and the journalists are talking to Algerians who basically say, you know, these people are looking down on us, we don't know what they're saying, or even when they're trying to promote the Fallah as a revolutionary subject. And, you know, the Fallah are not necessarily going to understand a long speech in Fusha or in French. And so, again, how ideologically, how much traction does Islamic socialism get is a big question mark. So Ben Bella both wants to promote these kind of foreign third worldists, or kind of more scientific Marxists, some of them, at the same time that the ulama has provided him his ideological founding for nationalism. And so he's really caught in these kind of, in this bind. People like Bashir al-Ibrahimi, who says that, you know, we fought the war not necessarily for a revolution or for socialism, but to reclaim our Arab Muslim identity. And so I think when you think the notion of ishtirakiyat al-Islam, or kind of an Islamic socialism of Islam, becomes a way of reconciling these different tendencies. And so, you know, what does this mean in practice? You know, the state nationalizes both different kinds of farms and industries. And some people, I think the scholarship in general, however, has been fairly unkind to Algeria's Islamic socialist experiment. Scholars tend to see it as a kind of ideological screen for Ben Bella's authoritarianism. Farhat Abbas, the assimilationist kind of a politician I mentioned, calls it communism in a white burnous. So again, the notion that this is kind of a superficial dressing up of. And I would tend to see it a little bit differently. And so I'll very kind of quickly in the last few minutes hint at how I present it in my book. And then perhaps in the Q&A, we can come back to some more contemporary things. And so rather than seeing Ben Bella's use of Islamic or Muslim socialism as just a way to instrumentalize religion, I think that the economy itself and economic orthodoxies necessarily speak to the construction of a people and a nation. And so this goes against people like Partha Chatterjee, who have argued that anti-colonial nationalism sees a break between the kind of exterior statecraft and internal identity or cultural work. I see the two as very much tied. And so French colonial development plans, and I particularly look at the Constantine plan in my work, saw Islam as an innate obstacle to a market economy. So they set up a duality between Homo Islamicus and Homo economicus. And so many of, and this is something you see time and time again with the racialization of Islam, is that it is something that is fatalistic, that is backwards looking, that cannot use technology. And the result of that is that it's not able to think about a market economy, because a market economy requires a certain amount of temporal abstraction. So under French colonialism, Islam becomes the crux of an economic program, but it's the crux that has to be overcome for liberal economics to succeed in a market framework. In Algeria, on the other hand, Islam also becomes the crux of an economic program, but it becomes a very different program. It becomes the proof that Algeria can be socialist. So once again, what is the kind of most essential trait about Algerians? It's Islam, and that has a direct connection to economic orthodoxies and capacities of the population. I'll just mention quickly that there is a kind of writing about a kind of reflected commentary on this that comes out of an offshoot of the Algerian ulama, a group called Al-Qiyam that's created in 1963, has a journal called Al-Marifa that's published with the Ministry of the Habus, and has articles, quite regular articles, on Islamic socialism and what that means. Just to give you a little example, one article claimed that while many of the self-management committees that Ben Bella had introduced were inspired by the Yugoslav model, and that was something that was very debated in the kind of models of socialism at the time, but the article claimed actually they were embodiment of the concept of hisba, or the muhtasib from the Abbasid period, right? The person who controlled the markets and exercised moral, religious, and economic functions all at once. There are many ways in which this writing sees socialism as a kind of orientation rather than a system. So they say it's not a nizam, it's not a kind of a ghaya, it's not an end in of itself. And that unlike communism, Islam was neither the enemy of prosperity nor of class differences. And so I'm sure we'll come back to this, but the question of class and the question of private property are the two major kind of doctrinal rubbing points. Instead, it's organized around a distinction between permitted wealth and forbidden wealth, and the kind of moral injunctions around accumulation. So I'll stop there. I know that's been 20 minutes, and I'm happy to answer any questions you have later. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Muriam. This was wonderful. And without any further ado, I would like to hand over to Willow to introduce us to the case of Sudan.
Right, I'll just unmute myself. Right, hello, everybody. Now, I'm going to say right at the start, I had been hoping to be further ahead with this research than I am now. And obviously, I've largely been held back by the impact of the pandemic. I was hoping to look at the work of a couple of Sudanese Islamic socialist thinkers, Babakar Karar and Mughani al-Nasri, neither of whose books I've been able to access either through interlibrary loan or through being in Sudan because of coronavirus. So what I'm going to give you here is, I'm going to draw on some of my background from writing a book about a man called Hassan al-Turabi, who started his political career as an Islamic socialist in the 1940s and had more or less distanced himself from Islamic socialism by the time that his movement took over the Sudanese regime in 1989. I'm going to give you a little bit of potted background on Sudan, then socialism in Sudan, then specifically Islamic socialism in Sudan. I'm also going to share a PowerPoint. So how do I do this? I click share screen. Oh, select the window that you want to share. Hang on. Can't find it. I don't know why it's not bringing up my PowerPoint. Oh, show all windows. Here goes. There we go. So I'll share that screen. Unmute myself. Slideshow. Slideshow. There we go. Right, so I'm going to give you a little bit of potted Sudanese history now. So I'm mainly going to look here at how the Sudanese nation state, as it existed up to the secession of the the South in 2011 was formed. Sudan has a very rich pre-colonial history going back to ancient Nubia, but mainly in this brief summary now, I'm mainly going to look at the processes of state formation in the 19th and 20th century and their significance for how discourses about Islamic socialism functioned. So 1821 sees the establishment of the Turkiya under the Egyptian Viceroy Muhammad Ali. So Egypt conquers Sudan in 1821. Egypt itself is a semi-autonomous territory of the Ottoman Empire. And this period is most significant because it first begins to establish the long-term distinction, long-term political and regional pattern in Sudan, which is the distinction between the central region around the northern Nile belt going down to about just past Kosti there, which you can see on the map, that central riverine territory, and the most marginalized regions, particularly in southern Sudan and particularly in the region of the Nuba Mountains, in the south of what's called the Fan. This really emerges in the 19th century, particularly when the central state launches extensive slave raids in southern Sudan, in the Nuba Mountains, in the Ethiopian borderlands, then followed by, once the Turco-Egyptian state itself formally abolishes slavery, a class of merchants emerges in riverine Sudan, known in Arabic as the Jalaba, which itself practices extensive slave raiding in those regions. And that essentially establishes the regional disparities that go on to have a long-term significance in Sudanese history. The Turkiya itself is ended by the revolt of Muhammad Ahmad al-Mahdi in 1885, who establishes the Mahdist state led by his successor, the Khalifa Abdullahi, up until 1898, when you have the Anglo-Egyptian reconquest, which establishes the condominium. Egypt itself is a de facto British protectorate in this period, hence the Anglo-Egyptian condominium, formerly ruled by the Egyptian Khediviate, later monarchy, but in practice with the British colonizers as the de facto rulers. This period sees the slow abolition of slavery in Sudan, but in practice, the British not only leave the social hierarchies created by the period of slavery intact, colonial racial ideology fetishizes the difference between Arabs and quote-unquote blacks in Sudan, the class referred to as Sudani, sometimes in the west of Sudan as Zurga. It fetishizes the differences between these groups, racializes the difference between these groups, and that has a significant consequences for post-colonial conflict in Sudan. So just as the condominium state ends in 1956, you have the outbreak of the first and then the second Sudanese civil wars. Again, these are conflicts that are often depicted in early political narratives and in Western media accounts at the time and up to the present as Arab-African conflicts, or a conflict between the Arab-Muslim North and the Christian African South. This historically and now was a gross oversimplification of conflicts that really had their root causes in patterns of regional marginalization going back to the 19th century. But anyway, particularly on an international level, this notion of Arab versus African conflict stuck. And when the Darfur conflict emerged in 2003, even though the Darfur conflict challenged the existing narrative to some extent, because this was a a predominantly Muslim region rebelling against the exploitative practices of a predominantly Muslim riverine centre, Western media, activist organisations, notably the Save Darfur campaign, picked up on this idea of Arab-African conflict being very significant in this conflict in Western Sudan. So other key points in Sudanese history to note, obviously 2011 sees the secession of South Sudan. The Darfur conflict happens in the context of an Islamist regime, the regime of Omar al-Bashir, who is indicted by the International Criminal Court for genocide on account of his role in the conflict in Darfur. And then after 30 years in power, Omar al-Bashir is finally overthrown by the Sudanese revolution, which breaks out in December 2018 and has now led Sudan into a transitional period. And that's where we are now. So I want to give you a little bit of background before I move on to Islamic socialism on the more, if we use this term, secular forms of socialism in Sudan. Notably, two particularly significant organisations in Sudanese political history, Sudan Communist Party and the Sudan People's Liberation Army, both of which have been influenced by the Marxian brand of socialism. So 1940s, Sudanese Marxists formed the Sudan Movement for National Liberation, which has evolved in the initial liberation struggle against the British, organising general strikes against British colonial rule, aligns itself with the broader Sudanese national movement. And in the wake of the October Revolution, that overthrows the first military regime of Ibrahim Aboud, we see the emergence of the Sudan Communist Party, which emerges out of the old movement, Sudan Movement for National Liberation, stayed underground for quite a while, but then emerged into formal politics after the October Revolution of 1964. The Sudan Communist Party is probably one of the most significant communist parties in the African and Middle Eastern regions at the time. Certainly in terms of grassroots support, it has a very real presence. It wins a number of seats in the 1965 elections in Sudan. But at the same time, if we think about those regional disparities in Sudan I was talking about, it's a party that very much has its core support within that riverine centre of Sudan and not so much in the marginalised peripheries. Notably, one of the slogans that came out of the October Revolution in Sudan was the slogan of the modern forces, and politics being led by the modern forces, not the traditional forces. In practice, the branches of the modern forces that the Sudan Communist Party drew strength from were those that had the strongest ties to the modern cash crop economy, particularly the cotton economy, the Gezira scheme of Blue Nile, and that's where the Sudan Communist Party drew its strength. The Sudan Communist Party is then involved in a military coup in 1969, which in a way is a response to the more religiously orientated parties in the second parliamentary democracy, passing a motion in parliament to ban the Sudan Communist Party on the grounds that it's an atheist party. This itself follows an incident in a teacher's institute where a student is deemed to have insulted the prophet, and that student is alleged to have been a communist. It's tied to the Sudan Communist Party, and the Islamists and other religiously orientated parties pass a motion banning Sudan Congress Party on the grounds that it's atheist. A faction, not the entire Sudan Communist Party, but a faction thereof, then back a military coup by a movement broadly modelling itself on the Nasserist free officer movement in 1969. That movement, in turn, that establishes the regime of Jafar Nimeri. Nimeri himself turns on the communists in 1979 after the communists are involved in a counter coup against him, Hashim al-Atta, and the Sudan Communist Party is driven underground. Its leader, Abdul Khalik Mahjoub, is executed, and it's attacked so vigorously by Nimeri's security services. It never really recovers the strength it had in the 1960s until arguably the current moment, when it's quite a visible force in the 2019 revolution. So what you see then is effectively two major developments in the wake of the collapse of the Sudan Communist Party. One is that within the modern forces, as they're termed, which is a term that's usually used to describe the women's movement, the student movement, the people that have come out of the developmental state, the modern universities, to some extent, that cash crop orientated economy. Within those forces, particularly the universities, the Islamists effectively replaced the communists as the predominant force there. The second major development is that Marxist ideology, in a way, shifts from the centre to the periphery, notably with the rise of the Sudan People's Liberation Army in 1983. The Sudan People's Liberation Army is formed by John Garang, who rebels, former army commander who rebels against the Sudanese government with particular support both on an ideological and a practical level from the Marxist regime in Ethiopia, also drawing to some extent on Tanzanian schools of Marxism, as African Marxism as well. Again, and John Garang's vision is the new Sudan vision. His movement starts off in South Sudan, and it initially has the majority of its support in South Sudan, where political movements up to this point had tended to campaign for either autonomy or outright secession and independence. John Garang's movement is different in that he has this political philosophy of the new Sudan, which is all about liberating the marginalized regions of Sudan, whether it's in the south, whether it's in Darfur, whether it's the Nuba Mountains, from the extractive and exploitative policies of the riverine governments. So his political philosophy represents the Sudan People's Liberation Army as a movement that fights to empower the marginalized, quote unquote, African regions of Sudan, and whilst being very careful to make clear that Arab and Islamic heritages are part of Sudan's history, it's a movement that very much just sets out to rebalance what it sees as a political situation in which Arab Islamic culture has come to be hegemonic, and African culture and the African regions need to be empowered. So the movement increasingly spreads to the predominantly Muslim north. Wings of the Sudan People's Liberation Army are formed in Blue Nile, in the Nuba Mountains, in South Kordofan, and with the outbreak of the Darfur rebellion in 2003, you see rebel movements in Darfur that take up Garang's vision, notably the Sudan Liberation Army of Abdul Wahid Nur and its various shoot-offs have adopted political rhetoric of the secular Sudan, contesting riverine Arab Islamic hegemony, very similar to Garang's rhetoric. What happens in the 1990s and 2000 is that Garang and the SPLA themselves move in the direction of securing the secession of South Sudan, and the new Sudan vision weakens. This is partly because the Marxist regime in Ethiopia collapses in 1991, and after that, the Sudan People's Liberation Army get a lot more of their political and diplomatic support from the United States, which is in itself, particularly because of its very strong Christian lobby, interested in engineering the secession of South Sudan. South Sudan, of course, does secede in 2011, not just because of US policy, but the wings of the Sudan People's Liberation Army that were formed in the north continue to wage rebellion against the government. So, where does this lead us in terms of the comparison with these Islamic socialists? The first Islamic socialist organization to emerge in Sudan is the Islamic Liberation Movement, formed by Babakar Karar at Gordon Memorial College. So it's a movement that, very like the initial Marxist organizations in Sudan, is formed by that generation of elites that that gained access to the state through the old colonial educational institutions that, in the case of Gordon Memorial College, morphed into Khartoum University in the post-independence period. So again, close to the experience of the Sudan Communist Party, in that it's an organisation that's principally formed at the Riverine Centre and by individuals who hail from the Riverine Centre, with one notable exception. It's worth noting that many of the initial members of the Islamic Liberation Movement, notably its founder, Babakar Karar, had been initially attracted not just to socialist but to Marxist beliefs. Babakar Karar himself attended meetings of the Sudan Movement for National Liberation before coming to the ideological conclusion that Marxist philosophy could not be reconciled with the Quran. Ultimately, Karar argued that the distinction between socialism and Marxism was that Marxism was exclusively materialistic in terms of its reading of history and its philosophical orientation, which he rejected in the name of a balance between cultural and materialistic readings. At the same time, he continued to criticize what he saw as the conservatives and the Muslim Brotherhood among the Islamists for seeing Islam just as a religion rather than a dynamic revolutionary force which could emancipate humanity. And so it's through this movement, the Islamic Liberation Movement, that Islamic socialism and Islamism proper begin what is an intimate but fractious relationship which would last for the rest of the century, the 21st century. The Islamic Liberation Movement, I should note, was never a formal political party in Sudan. This existed as a student movement for about 6 years before it split in 1954, in part as a reaction to the wider political developments caused by Nasser's very destructive rupture with the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt in 1954. The Islamic Liberation Movement split. Babakar Karar is much more sympathetic as someone who sees himself as an Islamic socialist to the Nasserist worldview. He sees Nasser as the genuine revolutionary, listed like Islamic socialists elsewhere, like Hassan Hanafi, Mustafa al-Sabai, and forms his own Jamaat al-Islamiyya, whereas the other faction within the ILM and broader Muslim Brotherhood at the time split off from Babakar Karar and very much identified themselves as the Muslim Brotherhood. Then in 1964, the Islamic Liberation Movement, the Jamaat al-Islamiyya, morphs into another party, the Islamic Socialist Party, which does try to establish itself as an electoral party in the wake of the October Revolution in Sudan, but has very little success. It doesn't really establish itself as a mainstream political party. And in that sense, and it doesn't in any of the successive democratic periods either, and in that sense, you could argue that the history of Islamic socialism in Sudan is relatively significant, except, of course, that the Islamic socialists do continue to influence two governments. One is the Libyan government, and the other is the Sudanese government once the Islamists, who on some level keep their ties to the Islamic socialists, take over in 1989. So this brings us on to Hassan al-Turabi, who, as I said, I've written a book about the guy. Hassan al-Turabi starts off his political career as a member of the Islamic Liberation Movement. He's recruited into the movement by Babakar Karar. Even when he joins the Muslim Brotherhood faction in the 1954 split, even after that, he continues to identify on some level with the political philosophy, or at least incorporates the political tactics of Babakar Karar, particularly this idea of front tactics, like trying to outbid the Sudan Communist Party and compete with the Sudan Communist Party in terms of developing a front in the women's movement, the student movement, the workers' movement. The professional movement in particular is significant in Sudanese history. And Turabi does that very successfully over the next 20 years. He becomes head of the Sudanese Islamic movement, which slowly acquires the term Islamic movement rather than Muslim Brotherhood, because Turabi tries to distance himself from the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood, again, almost not falling into either of those camps. They're identifying with the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood camp, or they're identifying with the Babakar Karar faction camp. And of course, Turabi goes on to be very significant in 1989. But I'll come back to the point about the Islamic Socialists' relationship with the Libyan government now. So 1969, after 1969, Muammar Gaddafi's regime comes into power in Libya. He slowly develops his political philosophy of the Jamahiriya, and the Green Book is published in 1975. Members of the Islamic Socialist Party, particularly Babakar Karar himself, and a Sudanese Islamic socialist of Darfuri heritage, Abdullah Zakaria Idris, having fallen out with Nimeri's regime after initially, to some extent, having embraced the 1969 movement, having fallen out with Nimeri's regime, moved to Libya and effectively become a part of the expansion of Muammar Gaddafi's political philosophy of the popular committees and the Green Book. I've seen narratives, which I don't intend to confirm or deny, that alternately position either Babakar Karar or Abdullah Zakaria Idris as the ghost authors of Gaddafi's Green Book. Abdullah Zakaria himself in recent interviews has completely denied this. He said Gaddafi wrote it. But these guys were involved in Gaddafi's political philosophy. Babakar Karar was heavily involved in the Gaddafi regime's newspaper, Al-Fajr al-Jadid, at the time that it was churning out the first chapters of the Green Book.
Sorry, Willow, to quickly interrupt. I mean, this is all fascinating because it also connects to some of the things we have discussed yesterday. But just for the sake of time, do you think you could wrap it up in 2 minutes or so? Or,
okay,
it's all really fascinating, but I'm sure we can come back to this in the discussion. Thank you so much.
So Abdullah Zakaria Idris himself identifies himself as an Islamic anarchist philosopher, and that's where he buys into the idea of the popular committees, particularly and he goes on to, he sometimes was referred to as like Libya's man in the Sudan, which was a moniker he himself unsurprisingly denied. But a lot of his critics have identified him with Gaddafi's project to expand his what was called the Islamic Legion into the Sahelian belt of Africa, and particularly that system of popular committees. So in this period, you have Babakar Karar, the Islamic Socialists, taking part of a broader front of Sudanese political parties trying to topple the Sudanese regime from Libya. At the same time, the Islamic movement under Hassan al-Turabi is going in a very different direction ideologically. This is the point at which the mainstream Islamic movement develops into what Abdullahi Galab calls the corporation. It's a movement that very much becomes wedded to transnational capital, flows of capital from the Gulf states in particular, develops its system of Islamic banking in Sudan, and effectively monopolizes, reconciles with the Nimeri regime, monopolizes the economy under the Nimeri regime, and is Babakar Karar, before he dies in 1981, starts to denounce this movement as the Islamic movement going in the wrong direction. Islamic socialists themselves are then involved in the Intifada against Nimeri, again as individuals, and I don't want to overstate their significance, but Maghani al-Nasri, one of the founders of the Islamic Liberation Movement, was head of the Lawyers' Union when Nimeri was overthrown by the Alliance of Professionals in 1985. Idris himself tries to bring his movement of revolutionary committees backed by Libya to stand in 1985. They tried to get involved in the Third Democratic Period, but are more significant when the Islamists themselves seize power, overthrowing the Third Democracy in 1989. Again, this is principally Turabi's coup, but the government at the time does try and form its own relationship with Libya, and sets up this system of popular committees based on the Libyan model, with some involvement from Abdullah Zakaria in particular. And the irony of this is that the current Sudan revolution is happening as at 2019. The resistance committees in the current Sudan revolution are actually reacting to this very model established by the Islamists in 1989, the popular committees, which became, unfortunately, like the Libyan socialist experiment itself, which became increasingly hierarchical and dominated, in the case of the Sudanese experience, by a one-party system under the National Congress Party. In 2019, what you've seen is a much more grassroots popular movement that's reacted and to what were initially supposed to be systems of direct democracy, but in practice became increasingly hierarchical. What you've now seen is a movement of resistance against these, the resistance committees. And again, I think the extent to which those are expressing a form of Islamic socialism, I think needs more direct research. There's been some good work on the resistance committees already by Majdi al-Ghazuli, which doesn't really focus on the on there being an Islamic socialist element. And a lot of the narratives at the moment are focusing on the return of more secular forces like the Sudan Communist Party, obviously the ongoing influence of the Sudan People's Liberation Army. But I think there's more research to be done there. So, and I'm going over, so shall I start now? Yeah. I'll stop the share.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's lovely. Okay, doke. I'm just going to quickly get myself a drink of water and I'll pop back.
Yeah, sure. So what I'll do is I'll use the opportunity to ask Muriam the first question. So I think Simon has questions, and then we can move on to the audience itself. I really found, Muriam, I found it fascinating because I'm intrigued around the question, one of the central contradictions when it comes to Islam and socialism is that, and it turns to God, right? One where there is God and then there's the absence of God. But I think personally in terms of my work, what I see as the central contradiction is prophecy. And I'm wondering how the Algerian ulama are conceptualizing or reconceptualizing prophecy. Are they reconceptualizing? Are they talking about a commons? So that's one of the, how are they talking about prophecy during this period? And are there shifts in those three strands that you're talking about? One, whether it's sort of the assimilationists, the Algerian, sort of the nationalists, and the ulama. Are we seeing shifts between those groups? Are there people transitioning from one to the other? Are we seeing people being persuaded by what the Algerian ulama is saying? And at that moment, I'm actually thinking of Amr Uzeygan, who appears, who writes a sort of book on sort of Islamic socialism around 1962. I was wondering if you could talk to that a bit as well. And I've got a question for you, Willow. And whilst Muriam is thinking about that question, I'll ask you mine. With the recent uprising or revolution, what we've seen is that women have been quite prominent in this, whether, we've seen Alaa Salah's sort of very prominently featured in the uprising. And, you've spoken about sort of a lot of Hassan al-Tarabi, Babikir, and I'm wondering if we can talk about the women in sort of, and their role in these sort of, in the histories of Islamic socialism in Sudan. Can we, how are they participating? Is it in the, and what are the different ways that they're participating? Is that something that you can talk to? So whilst I'm thinking that maybe Muriam, can answer the question that I asked.
Sure, thank you for those really rich questions. Absolutely, in terms of the fluidity among these three categories. And so somebody like Malik Ben Nabi, for example, who becomes a very, maybe the most prominent Algerian intellectual of Islam, is in Paris and writes about hanging out with the Masalli people and then deciding that's not for him. So there, absolutely, I think that this notion that there are three divided strands has been oversimplified. In terms of the ulama and private property, and I was actually thinking through this preparing my remarks for today. So the critique of the ulama by quote unquote, scientific Marxists has always been that they themselves come from this feudal background. And so they have to obscure, or they have to overlook questions of class and private property so as not to undermine their own material prosperity, right? And so one of the things I'm thinking about is, in some ways that already takes a certain Marxist framework for granted. And so how do we think about the tools of analysis vis-a-vis the personal trajectories of these thinkers? And I'm not sure, how to make sense of that. I will say that there is this more popular tradition of the Sufi Turk in Algeria that had also been more millennial countryside uprisings the Mokrani uprising of 1870, for example. And the ulama see this as superstition, backward. So it is a kind of, Islamic modernist project in many ways. So just to say, they don't have the monopoly on what it means to be Muslim. And so maybe in thinking about property and relationships to land, we should, take what they're saying seriously. I think that they were actually, I disagree with some of my colleagues who just see this as kind of all, one person has called them, the FLN, just method man. They had no theory. I don't think that that's completely fair. But like we would do with any thinker, the same way we would interrogate European socialist thinkers, there's a kind of exceptionality that comes with thinking about socialism, I think, in the Middle East and North Africa. And so I guess those are just some thoughts on the question of the ulama and property. Ben Bella himself becomes very pro-Fis, pro is perhaps, but he engages with the kind of more Islamist political movements at the end of his life. And so there is quite a bit of flexibility among the FLN and the kind of Islamic fringes politically. And I'm sorry, you had brought up a figure, was it Ammar Ouazzaghan?
Yeah.
Okay, who's, fascinating. And I mentioned him briefly because he does a series of interviews with Jeune Afrique and René Dumont in the early 1960s. And so again, just pointing to the fact that, these people are in conversation with broader trends. They're not just part of this Islamic socialism Algerian discussion. They are talking to kind of these broader discussions about socialist models. And in that interview, I don't remember exactly, but I believe he talks about Eastern Europe and Yugoslavia as the model that Algeria is following. One of my favorite quotes from Al-Madani, who is one of the ulama who, I just found it in my notes that I had for today, is that he says, al-baraka fil haraka, right? That benediction is in movement. And that's one way he is using conceptions of baraka and economic productivity. And so, right, I think the Islamic modernist component is really important in that many of them do buy into a model of growth, of accumulation, and yet a kind of redistribution based on certain moral principles that it is not necessarily, collectivization of the means of production in the way that we might kind of have our instincts. And so there's a whole spectrum there and a lot of flexibility in terms of ideological orientation, especially in the 1970s with Boumediene and then with the Civil War. Sorry, that was a long answer, but it's a very interesting series of questions.
Thank you. Willow. You've got to unmute.
So if I'm talking about women in Islamic socialism, I'll move on from the Islamic Socialist Party itself very briefly, because that was a small movement and largely male student dominated. But if I can talk about initially the relationship between Hassan al-Turabi's movements and the Sudan Communist Party, which shows this kind of intellectual kind of dialectic going on between the communists and the Islamists over the empowerment of women. The Sudan Communist Party was the first party to have a major role in empowering women politically in Sudan. Famously, it was a member of the Sudan Communist Party, Fatima Ahmad Ibrahim, who became the first elected female MP in Sudan after the October Revolution in 1965, had a major role in organising the Sudan Women's Union and campaigning for women's workplace rights in Sudan throughout the second democratic period. Then what happened, as I said, in the 1970s, because the Sudan Communist Party was crushed by the regime under Nimeri, you had a major transition where the Islamists positioned themselves as the faction dominating the so-called modern forces. And Turabi himself made a big thing of learning from the Sudan Communist Party's success in mobilizing themselves as a political force, by appealing to women. Turabi famously wrote a book, Women in Islam and Sudanese Society, which drew on the reformist ideas of Muhammad Abdu, on Qasim al-Amin, and talked a lot about the original Islamic society of the 7th century, liberating women before returning to the Jahiliyyah principles after the end of the age of the rightly guided caliphs. And his movement, actually in the third democratic period in the 1980s, actually had more female MPs in Parliament, admittedly a small number too, than any of the other major political factions. Yet at the same time, when Turabi's movement took power in 1989, the regime that his movement generated acquired a reputation internationally for misogyny. Famously, the public order police whipping women in the streets for wearing trousers, and Turabi's success was largely that he created a movement that generated social mobility for women who were who wanted to live up to a certain middle class ideal of propriety. And the reaction in 2019, particularly against the politics of public order police, I mean, famously encapsulated by the image of Allah Salah atop that car and among the revolutionary crowds. Often, I mean, particularly in the protests in the Riverine Centre in Sudan, you had the movement of the Kandakas, who identified themselves with Sudan's ancient Nubian heritage, Queen Candace of Kush, almost going against the whole Islamist principle of separating Sudan off from the age of the Jahiliyyah. Again, I think, and so that's the dynamic you've seen, Jenna. Yeah.
Great, thank you. We can go to Simon and then.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. I also have two questions, one for Muriam and one for Willow. Muriam, I would be curious to hear a little bit more about Al-Qiyam, the organization, the ulama organization you talked about, and its journal Al-Marifa, and you explained to us that they basically said, you know, the idea of the self-management committees is directly derived from Hispa, and it's not built on the Yugoslav model. So to a certain extent, this sounds like, you know, basically a reactionary, or more like a trying post facto to justify, to Islamically justify things that are there and to put an Islamic stamp on them. And would you say that this was sort of the general tone of this journal, that they basically approved what was going on in Algeria and were just trying to find an Islamic justification for why this was necessary? Or do we also find some more visionary positions and projects in this journal that go beyond sort of the status quo as it existed in Algeria at the time? So this would be my question for Muriam. And for Willow, so I was also curious to hear a bit more about how you would evaluate the impact of Gaddafi's Green Book in the Sudanese context. Do you feel not enough justice has done to the impact, or also the intellectual impact this work had? And is there something to be said for taking it more seriously than has been done in scholarship so far? And my second question would also be to hear a bit more about the personal trajectory of Hassan Turabi. Did he ever sort of justify his journey from Islamic socialism toward the right? Did he ever feel compelled to explain himself and to condemn his or to retract his earlier fascination for Islamic socialism? And how should we understand this? Thank you. And Muriam, you could go first if you'd like once again.
Okay, sure. Thank you. Yeah, this is a question I've really been wrestling with. I think undoubtedly the journals in Al-Marifa are not necessarily visionary in a sense of a new synthesis of ideas. They are very much looking back, whether it's Umar al-Khattab or other Islamic references to justify Ben Bella's policies. And, you know, I'm caught between saying justify and giving them an Islamic lexicon. You know, I do think that Ben Bella's relationship with these people is that he does need them for a certain kind of religious credibility. And at the same time, they're dependent on him. So there's a, you know, there's a kind of symbiotic relationship happening between Ben Bella and the organization of Al-Qiyam. And interestingly, one of the reasons for the coup of Boumediene in 1965 is that the ulama for sure, and other members as well of society, start feeling like this socialism is too foreign, right? That this is that these Pieds Rouges who mostly leave in 1965 are a foreign import and not really Algerian. And so Boumediene frames this as a kind of redressement, or, you know, fixing of the revolution that's gone off track. And that's very much caught up in this question of how native is this form of socialism. And for Boumediene and the people who support the coup, it's not native enough. And this is something, of course, time and time again, the notion that these socialist frameworks are coming from the outside, that they don't speak to the population is a common theme. Having said that, you know, I don't want to minimize the kind of thought that comes out of this group. People like Malik Ben Nabi, who I already mentioned, do come up through this group. And while Ben Nabi himself doesn't write about Islamic socialism per se, he does write about kind of the modern Muslim and what that means in a very Islamic modernist vein. And so there is an intellectual contribution to be made. You know, Ben Nabi's critique is one that, you know, the individual has to change in order for society to change. And he sees this as the basis of his theory of what he says is colonizability. And he wants to ask, why were the Algerians colonizable? And he means that less in the spirit of an apology and more in a, you know, very typical question of working on the self before working on a political project. So I wouldn't say that this is only a justification. It also goes on to lead to interesting debates in the 1970s and into the 1980s. But certainly I think that their writings specifically on Islamic socialism are less visionary and more an attempt at power positioning with the regime.
Great, thank you very much. Willow?
Okie doke. So starting on the Green Book, first of all, I don't think, in terms of recognition of the significance of the Green Book, I don't think it's been recognised enough that in terms of the kind of ideological basis for the project of the National Congress in Sudan in the 1990s. I mean, I think the Green Book was significant. I mean, someone like Tarabi, when he was ambiguously positioning himself as the face of the regime in the 1990s, probably wouldn't have recognised it, but the whole political structure of the National Congress in Sudan as it was first conceived was very similar to the system articulated by the Green Book. It was just the idea that you'd have popular committees that would feed into popular congresses, and each rung of the system would feed upwards from this base. I mean, yeah, it is significant in terms of Tarabi himself and whether he ever explained or attempted to rationalize his alliances with the military. I mean, it's interesting at the time. I mean, he's obviously gone through phases of trying to downplay it. The political tactic Tarabi often adopted was to try and rely on the military insofar as he needed them, whilst maintaining he was engineering a much more spontaneous movement. And that's famously why, when he came into power in 1989, he maintained he was just an intellectual. He had nothing to do with the regime. It was Omar al-Bashir's regime, and he'd present this narrative to people that there's this revolution going on that's spontaneous and it's nothing to do with me. Whereas in practice, the military were heavily involved. He did repent of the alliance with the military when Omar al-Bashir effectively ejected him from power in 1999. He admitted to the public. He said, "Okay, what we arranged was Omar al-Bashir goes to the palace, I'll go to prison," with a kind of fake imprisonment, and he significantly damaged his political credibility with that moment. But did say him and his new party, the Popular Congress Party, genuinely repented that military alliance. And notably, after about 20 years of involvement with the Sudan Islamic movement, it's quite a neoliberal movement, he aligned himself with the Sudan People's Liberation Army. He signed a memorandum of understanding in 2001. He entered a political coalition with the Sudan Communist Party later, and he started saying, I want to embrace the communist experience. I want to incorporate it into Islam, before his death in 2016. And I think the challenge for Tarabi was always the trust deficit at a popular level caused by his role in the 1989 coup. But yeah, he did try and distance himself from his earlier involvements.
Great. I'm not seeing any hands raised, but if you do have questions, do show your hands. I do have another set of questions for you both of that. Actually, we do have a question from Luke. Luke, do you want to?
Hi. So this is kind of addressed to both of you, I guess. I don't know if this has been raised. I kind of joined this late, but do you know of any response from Islamic socialists in Sudan or Algeria to Nkrumah's famous distinction between African socialism and socialism in Africa? And if you know of none, where would you place Islamic socialism in these countries between those two concepts? Thanks.
Muriam, you want to?
Sure.
Yeah.
I don't know, I can't think of a direct response, but I am thinking of Frantz Fanon's writings where he talks about stretching Marxism, and at that point he's very engaged with the FLN. And so I do think this question, I'm also thinking about Césaire when he resigns from the Communist Party, and he says something, says that what I demand of Marxism, something to the effect is that they serve Black people and not that Black people serve Marxism. And so the notion both of a kind of a socialism thought with different categories and references, but also one that's not going to play second fiddle to what the Communist Party at that time, which was quite strong in France, dictates as the party line. And so, I would also just say on a bit of a side note, but perhaps not really, that there's been a lot of discussion recently around Fanon's thought, and Algerians pushing back and saying, what Fanon was writing, specifically his articles in Al-Mujahid, the FLN newspaper, was really a product of a lot of us thinking together. And so, perhaps one way of answering your question would be to think about how Fanon was also engaged in an Algerian rethinking of what Marxism meant in a particular instance. But I can't remember anybody who specifically takes up Nkrumah. I'm sure it's out there, but.
Great, thanks.
Yeah.
I think I can't answer with reference to Islamic socialism. As I said, I haven't been able to study the texts of these guys in as much depth as I'd like. I think with reference to both Sudan Communist Party and I say Hassan al-Turabi's parties because he's at various points had an Islamic Charter Front, a National Islamic Front, Popular Congress Party. I think the Sudan Communist Party historically has tried to present its model as an African socialist model. They've often tried to distinguish their line from the former line of the Soviet Union as it then was at that time. At the same time, Hassan al-Turabi made a very big thing of making the Islamic movement in Sudan a Sudanese Islamic movement. This is why he never called his movement the Muslim Brotherhood. So in that sense, there has always been a focus on Sudanizing ideologies that you could see as emanating from outside. Yeah.
Sure. Okay, great. I think I'll ask the last question if there aren't any questions. And so it's really, I'm always wary about asking questions about the present and the future to historians in general, but I'm going to do so. I'm going to take a shot. Is there, I mean, in sort of at the present moment, whether in Sudan or Algeria, is there language of Islamic socialism? Are people drawing on the histories of Islamic socialism, or in the sort of the new world's imaginaries that whether young people and these communities are crafting for themselves? What is the role of Islam that is that you see in the present movements? It's open to, I mean, yeah, whoever wants to take that really first. Willow, you want to go with?
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, so, I mean, the challenge in Sudan for Islam as a political idiom is that the regime that has just been overthrown was an Islamist regime that has been widely criticised for political abuse of Islam, and many of the slogans against the regime use slogans like "No to the traders of religion, Layli Uddin," and in that sense, I don't think, if I was on nuances, I don't think you're likely to see Islamic socialism emerge as the dominant trend either in government or opposition for a period. I think what you will see now that advocates of various forms of Islamic political philosophy are freed of the fact of the Tawabist attempt to engineer an Islamic state, you will see forms of you will see attempts to distinguish from the Tawabist legacy. Maybe you'll see forms of socialist philosophy emerge that hopefully bring some kind of bridge between the kind of socialist narrative provided by the Sudan People's Liberation Army and the kind of forms of Islamic socialism I've been talking about. There was one significant guy in the transition in Sudan, has been a guy called Shafi Kadir, who was quoted with a widely recirculated remark in a seminar in Khartoum in 2019, where he said, this guy was a member of the Sudan Communist Party before he was kicked out of it. He said, what we need now is musawama tariki, a historic bargain that satisfies the forces of the secular left and those who, I think the term he used was those who advocate the Islamic choice. Not just the Islamists, but all these other factions, the Islamic Socialist, different Islamically orientated parties like the Ummah Party, which backed the opposition, even movements like the Justice and Equality Movement, which was formed by people who were originally Turabists and split off from the regime and became involved in the rebellion in Darfur. There are those various forms of Islamically orientated politics, that have existed outside of the rubric of the regime. I don't, from what I've seen, what I've read on the resistance committees, particularly Majdi al-Ghazouli's work, I haven't seen a kind of grassroots model of Islamic socialism during the revolution. But I think there's still a lot more research to be done, I'd say.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Muriam.
Thanks, and thanks for the disclaimer about asking historians about the present. I think that the question of Islam and political Islam in Algeria was very polarizing during the Hirak. And, of course, I'm witnessing this from abroad, but the fights about who's the fils were, did the fils, Ali Belhaj, was he present? And the very quick way to amalgamate all Islamist or Islamic oriented parties or actors into the fils is also something that the regime has benefited on for a long time. And so part of the reason that Bouteflika was able to stay in office so long is the way that he managed the transition or a reconciliation process that more or less closed the door on any kind of justice for what happened during the civil war. And so I guess, the answer from Algeria is complicated in that there is a socialism that permeates the kind of worldview, or a third worldism that permeates the worldview of the Hirak, whether that's about national resources, the resistance to the new hydrocarbon law that was seen as foreign companies, exploiting a national resource, and the imagery around that was, literally foreign companies pumping the lifeblood from the desert kind of thing. So certainly socialism, whether it's posed in those terms or not, is something that has been present, questions of social and economic justice. And the question about Islam and its role in the public life is one that has, I think has made a lot of developments in terms of an honest debate about the Civil War, but I don't see a kind of uptake in thinking about these questions in that vein particularly. I will say there are people like Abdallah Jaballah from the Movement for National Reform, the Harakat al-Islah al-Wataniya, who would never use the word socialism because it's seen as atheist, but certainly has talked about state-led development. The FIS had a lot of kind of mutual care in cities where, school supplies or medical supplies were distributed not in a market economy fashion. So I think that there are touchstones to think about this, but I certainly don't see the Hirak as a kind of movement that's thinking along those lines, even if they are rethinking third worldism and socialism, as well as Islam and politics and the Civil War. But I'm not sure that those two discussions are an answer exactly to your question.
Great. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Willow and Muriam, for your time and for taking us into very different contexts, and also for helping us understand new terminologies and how this is all related. I think this, everything is permeated by certain ideas and socialism, but certain terms cannot be used anymore or are too tainted and too toxic. This is also what we take away from this entire week. I would like to thank you and also thank all the participants for staying with us during this week. And of course, this won't be the end of it. So I think Layli and I will have to digest on what to do with it, but we'll certainly continue our inquiry and also maybe bringing other contexts and other scholars and colleagues on board. So thank you very much, and have a great evening or day. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. Thanks all.